Water types have been symbols of excellence for decades now in competitive Pokemon. Every metagame, just like the Hoenn region, is flooded with them. But despite their embarrassment of riches, there are some really awful water types every generation. So we're going to examine the original water types introduced in each generation and compare their competitive careers to each other's in that generation's metagame and determine which the worst one is. These are the Pokemon that make us turn to Game Freak and ask, "What are you doing here?" And we'll jump right into the first generation, as our worst water type is Seaking. Gen 1's race to the watery bottom seems pretty crowded at first, but the trench narrows quite quickly. There are 4 fully evolved waters below NU: Kingler, Golduck, Seaking, and Seadra. Remember, Kingdra doesn't exist yet. Kingler actually has a decent OU niche, combining Swords Dance with an attack stat tied for the highest in the game, alongside the auto-crit stab Crabhammer. Golduck isn't great, but it has Amnesia and good speed, so it can actually find some use in not just NU, but even UU. So it's between Seadra and Seaking, except it isn't, and it's not even close, because Seadra is genuinely a very good NU Pokemon. Good special, good speed and agility, making it a fierce late game cleaner. What does Seaking do? Everything Seadra does, but markedly worse. True, it has a much higher attack stat, but base 92 attack doesn't exactly make for menacing hyper beams, especially on a Pokemon that is otherwise so bland and outclassed. Meanwhile, its special is much lower at base 80 as opposed to Seadra's 95. Golduck also has base 80 special, but it's also got Amnesia and is initially much faster. Seaking's base 68 leaves it dragging behind the base 85 of both Golduck and Seadra. Even though yes, Seaking boosts its speed with agility, it has fewer initial opportunities against the meta at large when it's so much slower than the competition. It even trails behind Poliwrath, which is no speedster itself. Seaking is basically Seadra at home. In fact, it's so bad, it's outclassed by some non-fully evolved Pokemon. You would much rather use Poliwhirl, for instance, which is an Amnesia user, even faster than Golem, that also has access to Hypnosis' sleep. Heck, you'd rather use Staryu, which is no great shakes in NU at all, and yet is a far sight more effective despite its sub-Seaking special, thanks to its better speed and most importantly, coverage and Thunderbolt, as well as Thunderwave's paralysis. Seaking is well and truly fried fish, but it arguably hasn't been sizzled to such a crisp like our Gen 2 selection. But before we talk about the next terrible water type, here's something that'll protect you with the defense of a bulky water. Our sponsor, the GOAT, Surfshark VPN. A VPN, or a virtual private network, is a server that you can connect to that encrypts not only your private data, but also your location. You can even use this to pretend like you're in another country. Now, why would this come in handy? Well, with streaming services like Netflix, you're often region locked. For example, if I were to vacation in Japan, where there are no subtitles on my anime, I could use Surfshark and change my VPN back to the US or vice versa, and now I have American Netflix wherever I go. You can do this with multiple countries because Surfshark has 3,200 plus servers in over 100 countries. You supercharge any streaming service you have by doing this. And of course, being a VPN, Surfshark keeps your outgoing data encrypted and safe. For example, I travel a decent amount, which means I'm often at the airport and need to use the Wi-Fi to keep track of my spending. So I don't go overboard, because sometimes I go overboard on overpriced meals. But people on the public Wi-Fi at the airport could be lurking to access some of my sensitive data. But thanks to Surfshark, I just boot it up and my data is safe and secure. And one of the best features that separates Surfshark from the other VPNs is that you can use it on unlimited devices. That's right, no additional subscriptions required. You can put it on all of your devices. And there's no risk thanks to their 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you want a sick VPN and also support the channel to help us produce more content, you can click the link in the description below and go to surfshark.com/fallswipe for 4 extra months of Surfshark. And thank you so much to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring this video. Mantine is the worst Gen 2 water Pokemon. Wow, a surprise so early on. To be completely honest, I expected this to be Corsola, as I assume most people would. Corsola is famously a very bad Pokemon, whereas Mantine, while not quite the water equivalent of Skarmory as its stats would suggest, has at least done some stuff competitively even before Gen 7's buffing of its base HP and giving it Roost, which meant it saw actual serious OU play. This, in conjunction with how many junk waters are out there, again, Corsola, means the idea of Mantine at the very bottom of the barrel is difficult to imagine. But in our dedication to facts and the scientific method, we have consulted the most recent data on Gen 2 NU and verified that this is indeed the case. Mantine almost isn't the worst. It really is neck and neck with Corsola. They are effectively the same in terms of general uselessness. However, if you had to get something out of one of the two, say because your punk friend questioned your Pokemon Master credentials, you'd sooner go with Corsola. Water Rock is famously bad typing, and Corsola isn't even the best Water Rock in NU. It's outclassed by Ammonite, and by some distance too, but the normal resist, alongside Recover, allows Cursed Corsola to take on Cursed Porygon and Wigglytuff, while additional flying resist allows it to wall Fearow and Pidgeot as well. Of course, if you want a rock type, you'd almost always much rather go with Graveler, Pupitar, Sudowoodo, even Rhyhorn, or yes, Ammonite. Heck, it doesn't even have to be a rock type, use Magnemite and get the same results. But still, Corsola performing this knockoff pseudo role manages to barely edge out Mantine's completely flat non-niche. Mantine basically did nothing while pretending to do something. Sure, it could gesture at its huge special defense, but it proceeded to do nothing with it. It couldn't go on offense, it couldn't go on defense, it was just generally ineffectual. Yeah, it had haze, but it was so passive that it would just get taken advantage of every which way. Even the Spike's immunity was totally wasted on. Make no mistake, Corsola is effectively just as bad. And important fact, they're also both significantly outclassed by Tentacool. But in a head-to-head contest, Corsola is just barely, ever so impossibly slightly less bad than Mantine, even if you have to squint to even notice that there's a difference between their badness to begin with. There's no probing for such ambiguities in the unquestionable choice for the next gen though, as Love Disc is the worst water type of Gen 3. Love Disc is so ridiculously bad, it somehow manages to make Rainy Castform seem like a respectable UU threat. This is a Pokemon whose most powerful Ice Beam can never one-hit KO a bulkless Salamence. The damage roll is 83 to 97.8%, and a front to romance everywhere perhaps, that Game Freak designed the Pokemon of Love to be so magnificently useless. Yeah, some executives X definitely messed them up so badly and for so long that they didn't even take the retroactive opportunity to fix it by making Alomomola its evolution. Maybe they're just challenging us to not accept anything, and that we should have standards and a sense of self-worth. Yeah, that's the message behind Love Disc's base stats, rivaling those of most first stage waters. But it's got good speed and swift swim, you say. It's telling you to swiftly swim out of the pool of toxicity you've been gaslit into thinking is normal. Just like you wouldn't settle for such a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad Pokemon just because it's got base 97 speed, you wouldn't settle for a terrible person because of whatever their good trait is, because they're supposed to have more than one good trait. I don't care how good they are at it. And odds are, they're not even that good at it. You know how many waters have more speed than that? A lot. In a different vein, you know how many waters have less speed and yet push the boundaries of the infinitely expanding universe with how much better they are than Love Disc? Also a lot. Did you know Love Disc is actually faster than Kyogre? Yeah, I'll inform the Gen 3 Uber's player base and have them update their metagame accordingly. Kyogre will be there just to set the reins so Love Disc can enjoy its Swift Swim, because that's how it works, right? One person is there just so the other is there to be at their best. Of course not. It's as certain as Kyogre wiping out an entire sea of Love Discs with a single thunder. This little spiel has unquestionably been more useful than Love Disc's entire competitive career, and yet stupefyingly, there are more Pokemon to come that challenge its so-called throne, because they managed to rival its uselessness despite having so much more going for them. Chief among these challengers is the one and only Bibarel, as Bibarel is Gen 4's worst water type. Bibarel's been memed on as famously terrible before it was even thought about competitively. Everyone who played Diamond and Pro in-game knew it was complete junk, whose greatest utility was how many HMs it learned, so you didn't have to waste Cut or Rock Smash on your Chimchar, and that it provided a place for you to revive your Pokemon that Cynthia's Garchomp had just destroyed. However, when you really look at it, it doesn't seem like it should be as bad as it is, as Bibarel makes its fellow joked about Gen 4 Water Luminion look like Splash Plate Arceus. Bibarel has not one, but two excellent abilities. Unaware's Boost Ignoring has led Quagsire to scale some of the highest heights in competitive Pokemon, while Simple's Boost Doubling would break the daylights out of any decent Pokemon. So surely even a Pokemon considered lowly down in NU can still find some use for it, right? With Curse, Bibarel goes to +2 attack and defense after a single turn. With workable base 85 attack, this should quickly turn into some respectable damage. Plus, Bibarel actually has a very unique stab combination. Water Normal is great neutral coverage, commonly wielded by fellow physical waters Gyarados and Feraligatr, and they only have stab on the water part of that. So Bibarel has stab on the tried and true coverage and effectively uses Swords Dance and Iron Defense in a single turn. It also drops its speed, but it's even got priority, stab priority, and quick attack. Extreme Killer Arceus it might not be, but hey, it could work, especially since not by wasting EVs and speed you can bulk it out. Sounds like some sort of niche, right? To quote legendary competitive Pokemon player Michael Scott, well, it sounds right, but is it? Unlike the impromptu debate on the usage of whomever from that one episode of The Office, where Ryan indeed turned out to be right, these nice-sounding traits of Bibarel's didn't wind up amounting to jack. It's still so weak and frail, it wouldn't even help if it wasn't actively making itself slower, to say nothing of how its utter uselessness, pre-boost, makes playing around it an utter cinch. As for Unaware, well, you don't exactly need boosts against those non-existent defenses. Even the weakest of attackers suddenly turn into Garchomp when facing them. Any attempt Bibarel would make against even neutral hits would inevitably result in the Sinnoh Chain Chomp massacre. Most battlers have the good sense to stay away from such self-inflicted horrors, leaving Bibarel to sit at the Sawyer family dinner table of its worst-in-show status. Now, our next picks aren't quite so bad though. The more you look at it, you realize it isn't for a lack of trying, as Swanna is the worst water type in Gen 5 singles and Simipour is for VGC. Gen 5's lowest waters were still actually quite good, at least relative to the disasters of the previous generation. It came down to Swanna versus Simipour. Both of them were sub-NU by usage, but they actually both had NU niches. And not pure gimmick stuff either. They were much, much better than, say, the Gen 2 Corsola Mantine debacle. You could actually use them. However, unlike the Corsola Mantine debacle, it also wasn't close. Simipour was a clear step ahead of Swanna. While flawed, it was quite decent for its solid base 101 speed stat alongside Nasty Plot, which pushed its base 98 special attack to solid levels. Swanna had its positive traits, hence the niche, but it started to veer off decent avenue and come to live on the intersection of merely okay boulevard. Swanna had two excellent stabs. It lacked Hydro Pump for some reason, but Surf was still strong enough, especially pre-Gen 6 when it still has 95 base power, and it was accentuated by Hurricane, which in a similar vein was 120 base power. It left Mantine and its Air Slash in the dust, not least because of Swanna's base 87 special attack as opposed to Mantine's 80. It was thus much more capable of wielding the two moves' complementary nature. No Grass type would want to switch into Surf for fear of getting Hurricane into Oblivion, while no Rock type would want to switch into Hurricane for fear of getting doused by Surf. Both stabs fit perfectly on Rain teams. Surf for the power boost, Hurricane for the perfect accuracy, and even better, Swanna's ability was Hydration, curing it of status under Rain. Rain teams were rare in NU, but who cares? Swanna can set Rain for itself just fine. It is limited, but it is niche. On occasion, it can be pretty threatening. But putting its competition with fellow, arguably superior Hurricane spammer Articuno aside, Swanna was still the worst of the waters. The gap between it and Simipour not enormous, but clearly marked in the difference between their special attack and speed stats. Still, Swanna's easily the best of the waters thus far. Meanwhile, in VGC, Jellicent was an excellent Pokemon thanks to Trick Room, a water immunity, and Water Spout. You'd think no other water stood a chance in VGC, but somehow, the seemingly unimpressive Samurott surprised us with a Worlds placement. Everything else, though, went with no placements whatsoever, even in the Unova-only 2011 metagame, which would have been their best shot. This doesn't mean that they're equally bad, though. Caracasa has Sturdy and Stab Rock Slide, so that's something, while Seismitoad may have been uglier Dollar Store Gastrodon, but you'd take that and its Stab Earthquake and Muddy Water over most of the rest, including Swanna, which had Tailwind and decent speed, and Alomomola, which had Wide Guard, Heal Pulse, and the RNG-dependent Healer ability. That left the title of the worst to be a hair-splitting contest between Basculin and Simipour. But Basculin hits harder with adaptability, so you would probably take Basculin to get the most bang for your buck, leaving Simipour as the answer to this question that nobody ever asked in practice, though of course it could go either way. The upward trend of even the bad waters continued in Gen 6, as Barberco is the worst water type in Gen 6. If Swanna was unusual for being the worst despite being decent, Barberco's status as same is outright bizarre. This is a terrifying sweeper in NU. In addition to his broken boosting move Shell Smash, its strong base 105 attack stat was further bolstered by Tough Claws powering up its stab Razor Shell. Barberco was consistently one of the scariest Pokemon in the tier, full stop. It's not at all through fault of its own that it's the worst, but rather a case of seriously stringent competition. The next worst water type, Clawitzer, was a furious wall breaker in RU, far from flawless and ultimately a rather specific choice, yet it was still a step ahead, even if the distinction wasn't such a long shot. Barbarcle was actually viable in RU as well, but didn't quite manage the usage to truly be there. If it had, it would have at least been a closer competition. And it's pretty astonishing that a Pokemon of Barbarcle's threat was not just the worst, but by such a margin too. Gen 6 didn't add that many waters, but the ones that were added were all excellent, as after Clawitzer, you go straight to the territory of OU's Volcanion and the Uber Greninja. Well, unless you count Skrelp, which is water poison, before evolving into the Dragon Poison Dragalge, but it's not a fully evolved Pokemon, so we of course don't. Barbarcle being the worst of the Gen 6 waters is hardly the black mark on its viability it would be for most Pokemon, more an instance of something having to be the worst, even if it's something quite good. Gen 6's few waters were all bad in VGC, but probably because of the novelty factor, these Pokemon ill-suited to doubles still managed to find some decent placements. Perennial fan favorite Greninja could find some utility on the incredibly obscure team style of pledge stacking, while Clawitzer was a decent Trick Room attacker. This left Barbarcle as the worst in VGC as well, which really stung given how overall strong it was, but relative to its competition, it was all around worse than Clawitzer, as it wasn't as strong or slow in Trick Room, while the solo setup strategy of Shell Smash didn't really lend itself well to a Pokemon of its abusable weaknesses in the protect-heavy doubles format. At least it has Rock Slide. As the kids say, when there's a rock slide, there's a way. But this Barbarcle was no Stanwick. And then continuing the trend of the worst water not exactly being bad, we have Gen 7, with Wishiwashi for singles and Pyukumuku for VGC. Wishiwashi is such an interesting Pokemon. Its schooling ability means that so long as it has over 25% health, it remains in its school form, which has astonishing stats. Base 140 offenses, base 130 defense, base 135 special defense. What kind of Mega Evolution style Pokemon is this? What business does it have anywhere near consideration for worst in generation status? First of all, Wishiwashi retains the pitiful 45 base HP from its base form, which brutally undercuts its astonishing defenses. Second, Wishiwashi is ludicrously slow. Its base 30 speed, the same as Snorlax and Slowbro, making it very easy to attack and bring that low HP stat into that 25% range, where it transforms back into its base form, whose stats make Love Disc look like a terror. As a result, Wishiwashi is untiered. It still has a niche in PU though, as under Trick Room, it unleashes Choice Specs Hydro Pumps that would be incredibly strong by OU standards. Everything in PU gets decked. In this sense, Wishiwashi is still quite a decent Pokemon, relative to the early gen picks here anyway. The problem is that Trick Room is incredibly specific and thus rare, hence the non-usage even all the way down in PU. Funnily enough, Wishiwashi isn't the only untiered Gen 7 water. There's also Pyukumuku. However, for all its specificity, Pyukumuku is a tiering anomaly, because while it is untiered, it has also always been accepted as a stall staple in OU, as an excellent unaware alternative to Quagsire, and is similarly effective in UU, so much so that for a time, it was partially responsible for the unaware ban that was considered in that tier before it was changed to just Quagsire. Wishiwashi can't hold a candle to this, and since Gen 7's other low-tier waters like Bruxis, Araquanid, and Golisopod were also quite good, even a permanently schooling Wishiwashi would likely not be able to match them thanks to its awful HP and speed. One or the other, but not both. Still, at least it's got some of the strongest Hydro Pumps in the game. And as for VGC, everything lived in Tapu Fini's long-reaching shadow, while Araquanid was number 2 thanks to Wide Guard, low speed for Trick Room, and an ultra-strong Liquidation. Primarina was decent, and to our surprise and delight, Bruxis had one placement in a top 8, and Golisopod and Wishiwashi had some placements as well, meaning the contest for the worst water here is between Pyukumuku and Toxapex? That's right, insane though it may seem, Toxapex's singles-dominating toolkit renders it a fish out of water in doubles. That said, Pyukumuku has the exact same thing, but even worse, being just completely hapless. Toxapex won't do much, but it'll certainly do more, even if not by a lot. Thus, Pyukumuku is the worst of the bunch in VGC. And there were similar contests in the next generation, as Dreadnought is our worst water type for singles and Cramorant for VGC. Gen 8 brings us another contest between two untiered Pokemon, but this time it's not so immediately clear which of Cramorant and Dreadnought is the worst. Of course, Dreadnought has a Gigantamax form, but seeing as Dynamax is banned in singles, Gigantamax by extension cannot be used. One could view this as Dreadnought being the better of the two, which is why we have split this category. Whatever tier Gigantamax Dreadnought would have wound up in, it certainly wouldn't have been untiered, and Cramorant would have wound up as the third water flying type on this list. Instead, it's more like the second and a half. However, seeing as Dyna and Gigantamax were such broken mechanics, they were universally banned, we're choosing to compare the Pokemon in their base forms, and that's where it gets complicated. Do we have another Corsola Mantine situation on our hands? At first glance, it might appear so. Not only are both untiered, but neither are viable at all in PU. So how do we decide between them? We decided to look at ZU, the unofficial sub-PU tier. Usually we stop at PU because that is the lowest officially supported singles metagame, but here we're making an exception to solve this mystery, and our investigation has revealed Cramorant to be the clearly superior Pokemon between the two. Cramorant is no ZU superstar. Wow, the bar is low, and in fact, it's not even very good. It is a niche pick. However, the fact is, it has a niche as a defogger with good dual stats, especially since Surf activates its excellent Gulp Missile ability that slices 25% health off of attackers with potential paralysis inflicted if Cramorant's under 50% health. Dreadnought, on the other hand, doesn't have a niche even all the way down in ZU. It is completely and utterly outclassed as a Stealth Rock lead, its only possible role, by Kabutops, which is a genuinely great Pokemon. As such, Dreadnought is left to toil in sub-ZU obscurity, leaving it as the unequivocal worst of Gen 8. Sad for a Pokemon apparently chosen by Game Freak as special enough to get a Gigantamax form. And as for VGC, the worst of course is Urshifu Rapid Strike. Well, Urshifu or Dracovish. Nugget Bridges to sell aside, while those two reigned, Inteleon also registered a solid number of placements, as did the Rain Terror Barraskewda, and even Dreadnought has a placement. So it's once again a choice between Cramorant and, Arctovish. It may have Fish's Ren, but it's no Dracovish, and really just serves to mix people up. With far inferior speed and typing, it's not good, but we're gonna go with the freaky Ice Fish, since it could theoretically Slush Rush with it on Hail if you for some reason wanted to use some sort of awful mix of Arctozolt and Dracovish. Cramorant, on the other hand, has Tailwind, but it's slow, and it doesn't have Prankster, and it offers nothing else of interest. But at least Plup of Smash Bros. Melee fame actually did use it in Wolfie's Sword and Shield Invitational, but he didn't use it because it was good. He just really wanted to use it. I mean, it holds Pikachu in its mouth after all. This masterpiece of comedy aside, it's still splitting hairs, but yeah, Cramorant is gonna be the worst one here. And this need to dig to the lowest depths to find out which Pokemon had fallen further would happen once again in Gen 9, as Wugtrio is the worst Gen 9 water Pokemon. And honestly, possibly the worst Gen 9 Pokemon. The same situation, two untiered Pokemon, neither of which had a sliver of viability in PU, leaving us as impromptu detectives. It was between Wugtrio and Veluza. I was expecting it to be Wugtrio because being a water-type Dugtrio without Arena Trap sounds just as bad as a ground-type Dugtrio without Arena Trap, aka totally worthless. Veluza hardly looks like a champion itself, and I'm not just referring to its psychotic eyes that totally freak me out, but with the Shell Smash-esque Filet-O-Way alongside sharpness-boosted dual stabs and Aqua Cutter and Cycle Cut, it certainly could do something. Well, something more than Wugtrio anyway. Absurdly low bar though that is. Turns out, after a consultation with modern ZU lore, this expectation was completely correct. Veluza is indeed great in ZU. In fact, it's about the same as Cramorant was in Gen 8 PU, but it's got an actual niche. Funnily enough, Veluza had a slight niche in PU at one point, though that didn't last. Either way, the consultation was quite redundant, as the slightest glance at Wugtrio should have been enough to confirm its peerless uselessness. Like Arena Trapless Dugtrio, it is a Pokemon entirely devoid of purpose. Like really, what is Wugtrio supposed to do? Stab Liquidation off a base 100 attack? Yeah, it's fast. And it has nothing else it can do at all. Maybe you can use Final Gambit with that base 35 HP stat and make your opponent laugh so hard that they forfeit by accident. Yeah, honestly, Wugtrio is so bad, it genuinely rivals Luvdisc for worst fully evolved water type ever. Okay, it's probably not actually that bad, but it is so utterly pointless as to border on the absurd. It is perhaps the only water type in history where you look at it and you say, you know what, I'd rather use Bibarel. Then you get to VGC, and it's a real mystery who the so-called winner is gonna be. You could rule out plenty off the bat. It's not gonna be Tatsugiri or Dondozo with their doubles-tailored abilities, and forget the powerhouses Palafin, Iron Bundle, or Walking Wake. Even Basculegion and Veluza are obviously nowhere near these, but neither is Wugtrio anywhere near them, because just like in singles, it does absolutely nothing. If I weren't so particular about the common misuse of this word, I'd say it does literally nothing. Though even that's not too far off from the truth. Again, it's the fastest Final Gambit user. True, but again, it's also got close to the lowest HP stat among all Final Gambit users. At a pitiful 35 HP, you would do more damage with Final Gambit Starly and his base 40. Or you could use Scarf Annihilate and one-hit KO just about everything with its enormous base 110 HP, which is what people actually do. To the surprise of nobody, Wugtrio was the worst in both formats, joining its esteemed distinguished brethren Barberco for a completely conspicuous double whammy duo. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Corman, Daniel Isbeast, Eric Dissing, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Gameslayer, Nurse Jake, Pretzel SP, Sojiro Sakura, Spavoon, Gylaria, Soras and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu, Wardine for their major support of our videos.